Welcome to another weekly installment of Tutorial Tuesday, everyone. This is where I take on your questions relating to photography, being self-employed, and actually doing photography for a living. I can't wait to hear from you, and we're going to start out with some deep ones. Before we get started, I just need to thank everyone who voted last week for where the September photography workshop is going to be held. I'm happy to say that that's here in Utah, so make sure to swipe up, get on my email list, and I'll send those dates out shortly. Thank you very much for sharing your compliments about the podcast. To be honest, I wasn't prepared to be so emotional and so vulnerable. But for those of you that haven't listened to the podcast, go ahead and swipe up and it'll take you right over to the page where you can tune into that. Something that you wrote right there really resonated with me, and that is it reminded you of why you do this for a living. And I think that goes for anybody that's self-employed. We get all consumed and sometimes we forget and we lose our way and our passion for what we do. So thank you. This is always a good question, and I love talking about it because it can bring up spirited debates, and I'll address it in a couple parts. Part one will be what's required, and part two, what's the best practice for it. Okay, part one. Is a watermark legally required to affect your copyright? No, it is not. Are you required to have a watermark on your image? No, you are not. From the moment you press the shutter, the intellectual property to that image is yours. Now, you better be watching these videos all the way through because I'm not telling you to not watermark your image. I'm telling you that it's not legally required. But as a best practice, you should watermark your image because it's going to make it harder for somebody to steal. The last thing on watermarking, part one here for me, is if you do put it down there in the corner and someone steals it and crops it out, it makes it hard for that person to say they didn't do it willfully. Now, in Watermarks Part 2, I'm going to talk about the best practices with watermarks. I'm going to tell you how I use mine, how I came up with mine, and just my own opinions on watermarks that are out there currently. When I started out, I had my whole name written all the way across the bottom of the image. So it was Chris Dickinson Photography, and then the year. Now, that got pretty long, and I thought it was pretty obnoxious. Once I realized that my watermark didn't affect my copyright, I started changing the way that I put my watermark on my images. So the next iteration after my big long name was this. It was just 3 initials. Now for me, in those big long watermarks, Chris Dickinson Photography, it's a lot of characters. In fact, it's a boatload of characters. And I felt like it always took away from the overall impact that the image could otherwise have. So when I see them now, I just scroll past. Now, this is going to sound cliche, but there's a ton of companies out there that you'll pay to come up with a whole brand for yourself, you know, deer antlers and arrows and stuff like that. And I just refused to pay them, and I wanted to come up with something on my own. So late one night, I'm working in the studio, and I'm bound and determined to come up with a signature that's authentic to me. And after about 742 tries of writing something down, I came up with this. After finally settling on a signature as my watermark, I use that in all of my images. The only deviation that I make is I put an @cdphotog for images that come off of my laptop. And as far as the remaining best practices, my watermark goes on every one of my prints. And when somebody orders a print, my watermark shrinks down smaller than it does for a social media image, but it's still on there. The last thing that I would tell you comes down to more of a business issue, and that is when you start out, you don't have any brand recognition. So what I would recommend is put your name down there and put a website so people can go back to you. What I'm going to do is tell you the person's name, I'll link to their page if they have one, and then I'll tell you why I follow them. And just so you know ahead of time, the people that I follow inspire me to be a better human being as well as a photographer. The first photographer is not just one person, it's actually everybody on my feed. It's everyone's images that I see throughout the day that continually inspire me to get better. So thank you. The second photographer is Robert Capa. He's coined with the phrase, if your image isn't good enough, you're not close enough. He was a conflict photographer back in the early 1900s, and if you haven't seen his work, I encourage you to study it. Along with being a phenomenal photographer and also a teacher, Mark Bryant is just a downright good human being, and I've learned a ton from him. If you have the opportunity to attend one of his workshops, go. Along with being a Canon Explorer of Light, Tyler Stableford is a master at photography and cinematography. If you haven't seen his work, I encourage you to do so. He's also a good human being, takes time out of his day to listen to people like me. One of our northern neighbors up in Canada, David Duchemin, is a humanitarian photographer that continually encourages people to shoot from your creative soul and not be bound by the rules that we think are imposed on us. Another one that inspires me not only with his work, but also the storytelling aspect of it was actually our 41st president who recently passed away, George H.W. Bush, his presidential photographer, David Valdez. As far as portrait work goes, the first person that comes to mind is Dan Winters. He sets the bar so high. His images, to me, I draw a lot of inspiration from and creativity. Check his work out. This next one is actually a duo, and you won't find them on Instagram, but it's the writing of James Agee and the photography of Walker Evans in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. I would be remiss if I didn't mention my friend Matt Cohen. He and I have shot together, and if you want to see somebody that takes rodeo imagery and makes it authentic and makes it their own, go look at his work. And finally, I'll never forget this saying, shoot through foreground interest. That's something that Bruce Dorn said. He's a Canon Explorer of the Light. He's been around the block, I'm sure, 6, 7, 8 different times. Go check out his work. It's hard to imagine a time that you could ever get to where you lose your passion for something that you're doing and you just want that back. And although you go out and you take pictures, it just feels foreign to you and you're not connecting with your images anymore. What I would recommend for anybody experiencing something like this is create a personal project for yourself and always keep in mind that you want to shoot what you feel and not what you see. As you start that personal project to get back in touch, the things that you want to keep in mind are how to communicate visually. How does it feel when you're out there? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it snowing? Is it raining? Those are the things I try to communicate. What I would also recommend in personal projects like this is set tangible goals for yourself. So maybe that's shooting a waterfall at 1/3 of a second or shooting a night landscape at 30 seconds. Set tangible goals. What you're doing by setting those goals and attaining them is you're giving yourself a sense of accomplishment, and that goes a long ways too. So don't underestimate, setting those personal goals for your personal project. Oh boy, where to start with this? Man, this is right up my alley. Number one, keep business and photography separate. Just because you're good at something doesn't mean you need to give it away for free. Stand your ground, shake hands. The biggest thing that you want to do is make sure that you're getting yourself out there. Don't underestimate the power of shoe leather marketing or guerrilla marketing. Get out the door every day, build your clientele, and start shooting. I'd be hard-pressed to say that just one person inspires me. In fact, I would say that the whole photography community inspires me, and even those that you can find at the library still, like Avedon and Cartier-Bresson, those are amazing. Hey, look, the best camera you have is the one in your hand. And when it comes to a phone camera like the one that I'm recording on right now, just make sure to fill your frame and also pay attention to composition and your perspective. Those are the biggest tips.